Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Whitacre. And a few weeks ago in my newsletter, I asked what topic you'd like me to discuss. And the two options were boundaries. That was the first option. And the other one was coercion and manipulation and like propaganda and mind control. And boundaries won. And so that's what I'm here to discuss today is boundaries. And I really want to thank those of you who responded, who spoke up, and who let me know what you want to hear. So let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries come in many forms, and we see boundaries around us every single day. We might not call them boundaries, but we see boundaries all the time. Boundaries include things like fences, walls, railings, sidewalks, trails, the yellow and white lines painted on the road, the lines painted on a sports field or a court. Boundaries can also look like traditions, customs, rituals, common courtesies, cultural or religious practices. Boundaries include a company's mission and vision statements, bylaws, rules, codes of conduct, and codes of ethics. Boundaries include the Constitution, amendments, laws, treaties, contracts, vows, and other agreements. Boundaries include the daily, weekly, and monthly chores that we have to do just to get through life and keep our affairs in order. And boundaries are the routines that keep our lives functioning. We live in a boundaried world, and that's just part of life. And that's all I'm going to say about like a whole bunch of boundaries, because I'm here really to whittle this down and talk specifically about personal boundaries. What are they exactly, and what do they entail? And this is where it can become a little bit trickier because there really are a lot of considerations here. I wish it were a simple answer, and I'm sorry that it's not. So let's begin with the basics. Personal boundaries are the parameters and ground rules we set for ourselves within relationships. And that's important to remember. Our personal boundaries are for us. They're the ground rules we set for ourselves. We each get to decide what we will and will not accept within the context of a relationship. And that could be any relationship, anything from an intimate relationship, a relationship with colleagues and coworkers, to a relationship with friends or family members or neighbors. It's in reference to any relationship that you might have. And this is why I say it can be tricky, because when we look at the vast array of relationships that we have in our lives, it doesn't make sense to have one overarching set of boundaries that we expect to apply in every single situation we're going to find ourselves in. So it's quite normal to have different boundaries with different people. And it would actually be ineffectual in our lives not to. Because our boundaries are for us and not for others, healthy boundaries inform and guide our own words and behaviors in any given situation. Individuals who are agreeable and have an ability to respond often have the healthiest boundaries, as opposed to people who are contrary, impulsive, and prone to knee-jerk reactions. And just a quick note here, an agreeable person is not the same thing as a yes man. That might be a topic for a future video, because that's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself, but please note that there is a difference. So when I say individuals who are agreeable have healthy boundaries, typically, I'm not meaning yes men, or yes women, or yes people. Individuals with healthy boundaries know when to say no. They don't give up too much. They're not just willy-nilly saying yes and agreeing to things that they know they cannot do. They don't agree to things that make them uncomfortable. And they're not going to agree to something that's going to require them to overextend themselves. So people with healthy boundaries know when and how to say no. And there are three really important qualities that people who set healthy boundaries all seem to have. First of all, an internal locus of control. Number two, they're incredibly self-aware. And number three, they know their window of tolerance. So let's start with the first one. People with healthy boundaries have an internal locus of control. What does that mean? Individuals who have an internal locus of control believe outcomes are the result of their own abilities and actions. They can accept praise and have pride for their successes, and they can also accept feedback and make necessary adjustments when faced with a failure. People with an external locus of control often attribute success to luck, higher power, the universe, fate, having had the right teacher, chance, or some other external factor. Likewise, failure is also blamed on an external factor. As an example, if a person with an internal locus of control fails an exam, they're more likely to acknowledge that they didn't study hard enough, or they didn't prepare, or they didn't put in the work up front, which is why they failed. It's the result of their own actions or inactions. If a person with an external locus of control fails an exam, it's more likely to be the fault of the teacher, or the exam questions weren't written very well, or the dog kept eating my homework, or there could be some other external factor that they're blaming it on. They won't take responsibility themselves. So regardless of the external circumstances, a person with an internal locus of control will see themselves as having some agency to correct an error and move forward, whereas the person with an external locus of control will see themselves as powerless to all of the external circumstances in their lives. And this is important to be aware of. Do you have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control? Or maybe you notice that you have an internal locus of control in some situations, but then you shift to an external locus of control in others. So your locus of control, whether it's overarching or situation dependent, will impact your boundaries and how you set them. Furthermore, if you're able to identify the locus of control of the person with whom you're setting a boundary, that can be an important skill as well. And this is another aspect to become aware of before setting a boundary with someone else. Do you know them well enough to notice their patterns of behavior, not just with you, but also with others? Is the other person capable of holding themselves accountable? Do they accept responsibility for the consequences of their own actions? Do they make amends when they've hurt someone? Or do they accept responsibility when something goes right, but blame others when something goes wrong? Do they deny and deflect any accountability? Do they justify and make excuses instead of accepting the consequences of their actions? How you answer some of those questions could, in some cases, point to someone with a self-absorbed personality style or even a personality disorder, in which case your boundaries will look very different than they will with someone who has an agreeable, conscientious personality style. So it's helpful to know who you're dealing with before setting a boundary. And that's not always possible, but in many cases, it really is possible. So number 2, setting healthy boundaries requires a practice of self-awareness. And really knowing your locus of control is part of a practice of self-awareness. So I say that because I really want you to notice how all of this information kind of intermingles, and it's kind of hard to separate with any clear divisions because there's a lot of overlap in these Venn diagrams. And that's what makes it a little tricky and nuanced. So knowing yourself is imperative. So if you're going to set healthy boundaries for yourself, let's look at one area of life as an example. And this is an area of life that affects every person on the planet, and that's sleep. How much sleep do you need each night? Are you aware of that number that's your sweet spot where you're, feeling optimal and performing at your best the following day? And what evening routines help you sleep better? Have you ever played with that? Have you ever played with nightshades and eye shades and earplugs? Does that help you sleep better? Have you ever played around with keeping electronics out of your bedroom? How well do you sleep with your phone in the other room versus the phone on your nightstand? Do you have a set time that you stop eating for optimal sleep? And what boundaries have you established to protect your healthy routines around sleep? And are you aware, what if your optimal level of sleep is 7 hours, but that of your spouse is 9? You might have to have different, slightly different evening routines to maintain healthy boundaries for each one of you. So these are things that are important to become aware of with setting boundaries. And I'm only talking one area of sleep here. So to maintain healthy sleep hygiene habits, you might have to disappoint people. And again, this is just one area of life. There are other daily habits to consider as well, like eating habits, exercise habits, work habits, day-to-day living habits, and so on and so forth. But boundaries don't stop there. We also have to establish psychological boundaries, emotional boundaries, and moral boundaries. So the point I'm making is the more you know yourself, the easier it's going to be to set these boundaries with other people. Because if you have no clue what your psychological boundaries are, or what your emotional edges and limits are, or what your moral edges are, it's going to be really difficult to set boundaries with other people because there is an aspect of you don't know yourself well enough. So while it sounds complex to set healthy boundaries, it doesn't have to be, because the more self-aware you are, the better you'll be at setting boundaries. You'll know right away when a person or a situation is going to require you to step out of your own integrity. And by knowing yourself, by knowing and understanding the language of your unconscious mind, and not just knowing the narratives told by the conscious mind, by knowing yourself intimately, you'll be able to advocate yourself appropriately in the moment without having those hindsight regrets or thoughts of, oh, why didn't I say this instead of that? Or those feelings that come with being out of your integrity when you look back. If you want to learn skills to become more self-aware, go back and watch my videos from several weeks ago. I have one on the difference between interoception and introspection, which can help you with that self-aware practice. And then I followed that up with a video that shared with you several skills and tools that you can add to your toolbox. With practice, you'll get better at those skills. And the links are below in this newsletter. And finally, this segues into the third major thing that I mentioned earlier that's really important in setting healthy boundaries, and that's to know your window of tolerance. And you have to be realistic about your limits and your edges. In the resiliency workshop that I teach, we call the window of tolerance the resilient zone or the okay zone, because when you're in your window, which has a top and a bottom border, then you're able to manage life's up and downs with ease and with grace. And you might get a little irritated or frustrated and be a little high in your window of tolerance. Or you might feel a little bummed or disappointed and be kind of low in your window of tolerance. But that doesn't mean that those emotions dictate your words and behaviors. When we're in our window of tolerance, we don't take our feelings out on other people in tantrum-like displays of rage or in disruptive cycles of immobility or fatigue. Whenever we get beyond our edge and we're out of our window of tolerance, especially on that high end, we might get bumped into an angry, raging rant. Or if we get bumped low on that low end, we might get bumped into a funk of hopelessness. So you have to know your edges. What's going to push you over the edge and out of your tolerant zone, and what's going to push you below that edge to where you're just in so much of a funk that you can't function. So this is why it's important to know your window of tolerance, so you can establish boundaries that will help protect you from getting bumped out of your zone. It doesn't mean you'll never get bumped out of your window of tolerance or your resilient zone, but having an internal locus of control when it does happen is important for repairing any ruptures that may happen as a result. And when I say ruptures, people with an internal locus of control who can hold themselves accountable are going to be able to repair any ruptures in relationship with another person, whereas somebody with an external locus of control is going to blame the other person, not try to repair. So self-awareness is the heart and soul of setting healthy boundaries. And if you aren't aware of your limits and edges, then you won't be able to successfully set and stick to rules for yourself. So, the most important part of establishing healthy boundaries really is to know thyself. Develop the most important relationship you'll ever have, your relationship with yourself, and boundary setting will become easier and easier. So, I know this might not be the answer you were looking for, and I'm going to follow this up next time in the next newsletter with even more information about boundaries. So please stay tuned for that, because this is barely scratching the surface. And this is kind of preliminary information before we dive a little bit more deeply into boundaries and what they look like and how to set them. So I hope you found this information valuable. Please below subscribe and hit the bell. And if you hit the bell, the next time a video goes live, you'll be notified and you won't miss anything. All right. Happy self-discovery, everyone. And please share if you found this information helpful. Have a great day, folks.